Recently, I came across an article that tried to answer the question, how much would an iPhone cost if it was manufactured in America? Well, there are different answers, but one report came to a conclusion that it could possibly cost anything from $30,000 to $100,000. That sounds like an insane amount of money to pay for a gadget that would normally cost around $1,000. But that report also included the fact that the United States doesn't have the infrastructure that China and its neighboring countries have, where iPhone components are manufactured like semiconductors, screens, and batteries. But even if you built the entire infrastructure in the US, Apple would have to set the starting price of the iPhone at $2,000 to be able to make any profit. Simply because labor costs in the US is much more expensive than China. It doesn't matter how you look at it. It's more affordable mostly due to globalization. But the world wasn't always like this. Despite that the world has been trading with each other for centuries, the real globalization came after World War II, when the United States came out victorious and set its global world order. US companies had a green light to exploit the entire world. Shell, ExxonMobil, and Chevron exploited the oil around the globe. McDonald's, KFC, and other fast food chains opened at every corner of the world, and the world began drinking cola. American companies dominated the entire world, and nobody could threaten them because they've been under the protection of the most powerful military in history. Even as of 2022, 59 out of the top 100 biggest companies are American, while only 14 are Chinese, and the rest of the countries have one or two such a huge company, but are not even as close as US-sized companies. Instead of competing to challenge the United States' global dominance, each country focused on modernizing itself under this new world order. US allies of course benefited the most out of it, but whoever opposed the United States was sanctioned. Fast forward to 2022, and much of the world hasn't just become as developed as the United States, but exceeded the United States in multiple fields, such as the quality of infrastructure, the quality of education, and so on and so forth. The only aspect where the US still seems like it's way beyond anyone else is the military. The United States spends more in its military than China, Russia, UK, France, India, Germany, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, and Japan combined. So even though China considers Taiwan as part of its territories, it is afraid to take any military action since China is afraid of what might the United States' response be. However, on 24th of February 2022, the president of Russia decided that Russia is going to be that country that would end United States' global hegemony. So, despite United States' multiple warnings, Russia invaded its neighboring country in an attempt to make it part of Russia. You see, Russia didn't just start the invasion overnight, but rather planned it for at least 20 years. Since 2000s, Russia began building more pipelines to supply Europe with gas. All the pipelines were built at Russia's expense to make Europe dependent on Russia. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia spent billions of dollars to control Ukrainian politics. But when it failed to do so, it peacefully annexed Crimea to see what would be the reaction of the international community. Surprisingly, the world didn't really care much because Ukraine wasn't important to anyone. So Russia spent the next 8 years making the world even more dependent on it. It became world's largest manufacturer of fertilizers, world's largest exporter of grain, made Europe entirely dependent on its gas, and so on and so forth. However, that is still not enough. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and multiple gas pipelines are going through Ukrainian land. So unless Ukraine becomes Russia's puppet state, Russia has no chance at challenging United States' global hegemony, especially if Ukraine is going to be a US ally. Russia understands that, and it's nowhere close to competing with the United States for global dominance. But it doesn't even want to do that. Russia's objective is to make the Western Europe, United States' main ally, dependent on Russia to reduce US influence over the continent. That's why making Ukraine and Belarus part of Russia are an essential part of the plan. Down in the south, China has a similar plan. Competing with the US military is a nightmare. However, no matter how mighty is the United States Navy, enforcing your order on the other side of the world is much more difficult, and that's the weakness that China wants to exploit. China doesn't have to build such a huge navy to enforce its dominance over Southeast Asia, which is why it is building man-made islands on top which it is building military bases, indebting the surrounding countries to take over their ports and turn them into military ports. China has increased its military budget from $20 billion in 2000 to around $300 billion in 2022, and plans to spend around $1.5 trillion over the next 5 years on its military, which is twice the budget of the United States' entire annual budget. With Russia making Europe more dependent on it and China enforcing its hegemony over Southeast Asia, the post-World War II global order that the US has said is going to vanish, and a new global world order most likely won't be as favorable to the US as it has been for the last few decades. But United States isn't just sitting over there and just watching. The US started a trade war with China. It banned Chinese-made smartphones in US and even tried to ban TikTok, imposed tariffs and barriers over Chinese companies, banned chip manufacturers from selling high-end chips to China, and the list goes on and on. It also started IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, an economic initiative launched by United States President Joe Biden, which focuses on deepening economic ties with the United States, where the US would give these countries access to the US market, and also an opportunity for these countries to replace China as the global manufacturer. American companies already moving their plants to these countries. Apple already began manufacturing iPhone in India. While on the other side, to combat Russia, US is supplying Ukraine with all the weapons that it needs to prolong this conflict for as long as possible, to drain Russia from its resources. Despite how many times the Western media might claim that Ukraine is winning this war, worst case scenario, Russia is going to nuke Ukraine and make it part of Russia. That sounds very unlikely, but you have to understand that for the past 20 years, Russia was preparing to take over Ukraine, and a defeat in this war means an end to all Russia's ambitions to be a regional power. It could even mean a collapse of the Russian state as we know it today. That's not a justification of the war, of course. I'm not supporting Russia, it's just what it is. It's a plain fact. But Russia doesn't want to nuke Ukraine. The fact that Russia wants to preserve as much as possible of Ukraine. That might sound like a Russian propaganda, but you have to understand that if Russia takes over entire Ukraine, it has to rebuild everything that it has destroyed. That money will come from Russia's budget. So it's in the best interest of Russia to win this war with as little damage to Ukraine as possible. But Russia's military doesn't seem competent enough to do so. That's why it is either going to destroy Ukraine and take it, or lose the war. The United States also used this war to make Europe less dependent on Russia and more dependent on itself. Europe no longer buys oil and gas from Russia. It has cut almost all of its trading ties with Russia and even closed its aerospace to Russian planes. The longer the war extends, the less reliable Europe will become on Russia, the less resources Russia will have to rebuild its economy and Ukraine. So the less influential it will be on the global stage. If the US wanted this conflict to end, it could have sent over 100 HIMARS to Ukraine and more advanced weapons to defeat Russian forces. But that could lead Russia to use nuclear weapons, which could spike World War III. That's not what the US wants. So it would rather send to Ukraine enough weapons to exhaust Russian military to the point where it won't be able to engage in any military conflict for the next 10 or 15 years. So what's waiting around the corner isn't just another recession, but a stagflation, because prices will keep rising due to international conflicts until the world agrees on a new world order. That could take another year or 2 or 3. American companies won't have the advantage they had in the last 4 or 5 decades, and American influence will diminish across the globe, which means the dollar will become less influential, which means the US will no longer be able to solve its problems by printing money. Whether that will happen or not, it depends on how successful China will become and more influential than the United States in Southeast Asia, and Russia taking over Ukraine and making Europe more dependent on Russia. Because what could happen is that the US will reinforce its global dominance, but until that happens, a global stagflation is inevitable. That's it for today. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.